Nasir bin Murshid was probably born sometime between 1580 and 1600, in what is now modern-day Oman. He was born to one of the many tribes of Oman, this one being named the Yoruba tribe. Not much is known of the early life of Nasir, but we do know that he was a follower of the Ibadi sect of Islam, as his whole tribe was. I made a video about how Ibadi Islam got its name linked here, if you'd like to check that out. Anyways, Nasir witnessed as the Omani coastline became dominated by the colonial Portuguese Empire. They had taken the important coastal cities of Sur, Kurat, Muscat, and Sohar. This foreign occupation severely weakened the current ruling dynasty of Oman, who called themselves the Nobahani. This dynasty would become a microcosm of the split and feuding tribal society that Oman had devolved into. Two Nobahani brothers entered into a civil war, further splitting their weakened realm. This civil war was only ended when one of the brothers' cousins, named Omar bin Himyar, defeated the brothers and reconsolidated peace in Oman, although Oman was still split along tribal and religious lines. Ibadi was the dominant religion. Then over time, more and more Sunni Muslims migrated into Oman until they made up a large portion of the population. This would prove to be a slight problem for the mostly Ibadi rulers of Oman. Omar bin Himyar ruled until his death in 1624. He left behind no heirs and was the last of the Nabhani dynasty. An already divided Oman was once again split, this time on who should be the new ruler. Ultimately, an election would take place at Rustak, with the two main contenders belonging to the Yoruba tribe, who remained as one of the most dominant ones in the region. Ibadi Islamists believed in voting for their leaders and deposing them if necessary, so a vote was cast over who should be the next imamate of Oman. The two main candidates would be Malik bin Abdul Arar, who controlled Rustak Fort, and Nasir bin Murshid, who was one of the leaders of the Yoruba tribe. Ultimately, the decision would be unanimous, and in favor of Nasir bin Murshid. Nasir was only seen as the rightful imam only by parts of the Yoruba tribe and a few small tribes in his proximity. This would lead to a need for almost immediate conquest to unify Oman. First, he took Rustak Fort, then moved on to Nakal Fort in 1625. Then in that same year, the new imam took Izka, then the ever-important city of Nizwa. Nizwa had previously been the capital of the Omani Imamate, and capturing this city would add a huge amount of prestige and legitimacy to Nasir's rule. Immediately after capturing the city, he moved his own capital to Nizwa, formally cementing the Yoruba dynasty of Oman. Nasir continued his campaigns, mostly bringing the Ibadi Muslims into his realm, who would accept his rule much faster than the Sunni Muslims in Oman would. The main Sunni tribe in Oman was called the Nizar tribe, that controlled the northern interior region of Oman called Al-Duraya. The Nizar were a fierce enemy, who conducted a long guerrilla campaign against Imam Nasir. The Nizar campaign lasted about 4 years and never really ended. Even after the Nizar tribes surrendered, they still continued to raid deep into Oman until the early 1630s. With the Nizar tribes mostly quelled, and most of the Ibadi tribes unified, there was only one thing left to do to restore the imamate of Oman completely, and this was to kick out the Portuguese from their coastline. In 1633, a unified Omani army was assembled to do just that. The goal was the ever-important city of Muscat. Unfortunately, the city was too heavily defended by the Portuguese, who managed to push back the Omanis. With this defeat, Nasir decided to take an easier route and targeted the city of Jolfar, that was protected by 2 forts. This time, the Omani tribes found success, and for the first time, managed to kick out their colonial oppressor. In that same year of 1633, Nasir ordered his army to take the well-defended fort at the city of Sohar, but again, the Omanis were repulsed in the resulting siege. After this, Nasir signed a truce with Portugal to cease the warfare. But this was just a trick. Why play fair when your enemy has huge cannons on huge boats with a seemingly endless supply of ammo and gunpowder? This surprise attack would shift Nasir's fortunes, who captured the coastal cities of Sur and Kuwait. Now, Portugal only retained control over 2 cities of Muscat and Sohar, until Sohar fell in 1643 to Imam Nasir. Only one more city, and perhaps the most important one, and Oman would finally be unified for the first time in generations. To get the supplies needed to take Muscat, Nasir signed a trading rights treaty with Britain in 1646. The fight for Muscat would be resumed 2 years later in 1648. Even with British supplies, the walls of Muscat held firm. The two sides would once again come to a treaty in October of 1648. With the eventual capture of Muscat in the foreseeable future, the aged Nasir had only to wait to finally expel the colonizers. But unfortunately, before his lifelong goal of unification was completed, Nasir would pass away on April 14th of 1649. He left behind no sons to pass his title on to, so his cousin, Sultan bin Saif, succeeded him. Imam Nasir bin Murshid rose up in a time of chaos in Oman. In 25 years of reign, he somehow managed to bring together the splintered tribes of Oman and almost managed to completely kick out the more militarily advanced Portuguese, an incredible feat that is something of an anomaly for the colonial time period. When many think of 17th century colonization, most of the time, it's viewed as a one-way fight that usually ends with the European power militarily dominating whoever their opponent might be. Largely, this is a correct statement, but a few countries remain the exception to this colonial rule. It is important that we remember those countries and people that managed to free themselves from the shackles of colonization. Most countries would have just been happy enough to kick out their colonizer from their own land. However, in this particular case, the formerly colonized started to take the fight directly to their colonial oppressor. The two countries in question are, of course, Oman and their former colonizer, Portugal. The following story is one of unification, liberation, and piracy, albeit very justifiable piracy. The leader who was capable of these feats was named Imam Sultan bin Saif, the second ruler of the Yoruba dynasty of Oman. Sultan bin Saif's story starts sometime in the early decades of the 17th century. We have no idea when exactly he was born, but we do know at least who his father was. His father's name was Saif bin Malik bin Belarab al-Yoruba, the uncle of Nasir bin Mushid, who, in 1624, was elected as the ruler of Oman and the first imam of the Yoruba dynasty. When Sultan bin Saif was born, this would make him the cousin of Imam Nasir bin Mushid. Unfortunately, we have no idea who his mother was, or how Sultan bin Saif spent his early life, until 1649. In this year, Imam Nasir bin Mushid would pass away. His succession would be determined and subject to the same voting council that had unanimously elected him the imam. The voting council would convene at Rustak, same as it had when they had elected Nasir as their imam. There wasn't a clear-cut answer with who would succeed Imam Nasir, for a few different reasons. For one, Nasir had no children of his own, and even if he did, this meant very little to the voting council. The Ibadi rulers of Oman were selected, not by blood, but by merit. While Imam Nasir bin Mushid was being buried at the city of Nizwa, the Rustak Council was voting on who should succeed him. Just like Nasir's election, this vote would also be unanimous. Sultan bin Saif was selected as the second imam of the Yoruba dynasty of Oman on April 14th of 1649. His first year as imam would be a period of preparation. Preparation to conclude what his predecessor had started. The removal of Portuguese influence from the Omani coastline was Sultan bin Saif's first priority. Imam Nasir's campaigns against Portugal had seen the reclamation of all of Oman. All of Oman, except for the port city of Muscat, whose forts held firm every time that Nasir attempted to take back the city. The Portuguese navy, which at this point was one of the best in the whole world, always enabled for a steady supply of weaponry and food to flow into Muscat, even if one of the forts there was under siege. The city of Muscat was held by three impressive Portuguese fortresses. On the left side of the port was Al-Jalali Fortress, and on the right side of Muscat's port was Al-Marani Fortress. In between these two fortresses, positioned on a steep hill, was the fortress of Mutra. These three primely positioned forts were all connected by one thing: the ocean. Imam Sultan began to challenge Portuguese dominance over the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf by ordering for the construction of a much larger fleet than had previously been seen under Nasir bin Mushid. With this fleet being constructed and his army assembling, Imam Sultan had only to wait until he could unify Oman and complete his cousin's lifelong work. By November 1649, the same year that he was elected imam, Sultan bin Saif put the largest Portuguese fort in the area under siege, that of course being Mutra. This fortress had long been a thorn in Imam Nasir bin Mushid's side. He could never take it. Yet again, he wasn't his cousin. Two accounts separate on how exactly, but both state that Mutra was taken from Portugal in a sneak attack. One account says that a small number of soldiers did a nighttime attack and managed to storm the gates, while the other account says that a group of Omani soldiers snuck into Mutra dressed as peasants and hiding weapons under carts of vegetables. No matter the case, Muttra fell to Imam Sultan bin Saif. On the 28th of January, after a blockade and siege of both Fort al-Jalali and Fort al-Mirani, the Portuguese finally surrendered and returned all of Oman back to the local populace. In under a year, Imam Sultan bin Saif had completed the lifelong mission of his cousin. With no clear direction on where to focus his attention to now, Imam Sultan began looking for ideas. He didn't have to look very far. Sitting in the harbor of Fort Muttra was two top-of-the-line Portuguese warships. With his own navy now sitting next to his two new additions, a plan started to storm the mind of Imam Sultan. It was time to take the fight to where it hurt the Portuguese the most, the ocean. The pirate Imam of Oman was now set loose on the Indian Ocean. For the Portuguese sailing there, the next 30 years of his reign would be one spent in fear. Taking the fight to his colonial oppressor, Imam Sultan began intercepting Portuguese trading vessels. The ships that the Omani navy did not sink, they added to their own fleet. The Omani navy was already filled with experienced sailors and warriors, but now the fleet was slowly modernizing itself, at least up to Portuguese standards at that time. The Portuguese trading outposts and colonies near Oman were located in India and in East Africa. The largest and most prosperous of these colonial possessions was Bombay, a chain of 7 islands just off the west coast of India. Today, this area is the second most populated city in India and a center of trade and business. In 1650, there was not much of a difference. In 1655, after 5 years of preying on Portuguese shipping in the West Indian Ocean, the Imam began to grow bold. With his navy now comparable to any Portuguese fleet, his confidence grew. It was time to not only face their former colonizers at sea, but also to attack them over those seas, and directly into the Portuguese colonies themselves. In 1655, Sultan bin Saif ordered for a raid to be carried out on Portuguese-controlled Bombay. With his fleet blockading the Portuguese navy, Sultan bin Saif raided one of the more lightly defended 7 islands of Bombay. After a short battle, the Portuguese on this island surrendered, as the Omani fleet rained cannon fire on them. The Omani quickly filled their boats with all the Portuguese treasure and supplies on the island. The Omani navy then made a safe withdrawal and returned to Imam Sultan, ships filled to the brim with Portuguese goods. The fear of the pirate Imam now extended to every Portuguese port in the West Indian Ocean. This, however, was just the beginning of the Omani raids. Before his next coastal raid, the pirate ruler returned to intercepting the Portuguese at sea for another 5 years. Then, in 1661, the Omani fleet arrived in India, blockading the Portuguese 7 islands of Bombay, this time choosing a different island to raid. The Omani Marines carried out a swift raid and left nearly as soon as they came. For Portugal, this was nothing short of an embarrassment. Seeing that the defense of these 7 islands costed more than it was worth, the Portuguese king just got rid of them. When King Charles II of England married the daughter of King John IV of Portugal, King John gave the 7 islands of Bombay, even the recently raided one, to the British Empire. Imam Sultan had lost an easy enemy target, although he did help in removing more Portuguese influence around the Indian Ocean. The Omani Imam would need to find a new target. His gaze shifted slightly to the west. On the coast of West India, not far from Bombay, was a Portuguese trading fort of Dhu. On 3 separate occasions, the Omani Navy raided the outpost with varying levels of success. One in 1668, another in 1670, and a final raid in 1676. However, the most ambitious plan put forth by Imam Sultan was nowhere near India. Sometime in the mid-1650s, a man from Africa arrived in Muscat. He sought out for the Imam. Knowing of his naval strength and willingness to fight the Portuguese, he presented Sultan an offer. At this time, the Portuguese Empire held colonies all along the east coast of Africa. This man, who was from modern Kenya, offered the coastal city of Mombasa to the Imam, and all he had to do was kick the Portuguese out. In 1657, Imam Sultan bin Saif sent a navy and an army south towards Mombasa. Not only was the Imam a liberator, but he was now also colonizing his former colonizer. The Portuguese fort at Mombasa was no easy capture for the Omanis. The Omani navy managed to successfully blockade the port, but still they could not crack through the Portuguese defenses on land. The Portuguese were now cut off from their supply ships, resorted to living off the coastal African land. This stalemate lasted for a total of 5 years, until finally the Portuguese surrendered in 1662. Mombasa, which was one of the greatest cities in East Africa and one of the crown jewels of the Portuguese Empire, was now part of the growing Omani Empire. The riches of Mombasa were then taken back to Oman, while an Omani governor was installed to manage this far-from-home city, along with a strong garrison. Shortly after the fleet of the Imam left, Mombasa came under siege again. This time, it was the Portuguese, who now attacked the combined forces of the local Mombasans and the Omanis. Their colonial subjects were starting something of a coalition. Portugal's response would be brutal. What took the Omanis 5 years only took the Portuguese a few months to besiege and take Mombasa. The Omani governor and garrison inside were killed or enslaved, and colonial rule was re-established harshly. Oman was forced to leave, but soon enough, they would return. By 1676, after a raid on the Portuguese Indian city of Dhu, all land raids under Imam Sultan concluded, and the Imam returned to pirating the Portuguese shipping in the West Indian Ocean. The wealth brought into Oman by Imam Sultan's piracy was a boon on the local economy. The piracy also enabled for the protection of Omani traders, who ventured as far as Indonesia. With this newfound prosperity, the Imam pumped a lot of that money straight back into Oman. He ordered for the construction of an underground plumbing system in his capital of Nizwa. Also in Nizwa, he ordered for the construction of a huge round defensive tower that took a total of 12 years to build. The Imam was also devoted to the protection of his citizens, with just laws and a strong central government to enforce those laws. Imam Sultan bin Saif was so loved and felt so protected in Oman that he would frequently walk in public with no bodyguards at his side. The Imam set his focus to more public works until his death in 1679, although sources will go back and forth on his exact death date. He would be succeeded not by a voting council, but directly by his son, Bil Arab bin Sultan. The life of Sultan bin Saif was surely an exciting one, and a unique one. In 30 years of reign, he managed to unify all of Oman, and put fear into any Portuguese that found themselves in or near the West Indian Ocean. The pirate Imam was buried next to his cousin, Imam Nasir bin Mushid, at the city of Nizwa. Jabreen Castle is by far one of the most beautiful pieces of architecture on the Arabian Peninsula. Certainly, it is the most awe-inspiring castle located in the heart of the modern-day country of Oman. It simply dominates the skyline of the small town and desert that surround it. The fort was finished in 1675, and its construction was funded by Bilarab Yaruba, the son of the ruler of Oman, Imam Sultan. Imam Sultan, as Yorubid traditions seem to permit, had made a career and fortune from fighting the Portuguese Empire. He even ventured as far as raiding Portuguese colonies in India and briefly conquered a Portuguese settlement in East Africa named Mombasa. Oman prospered under Imam Sultan's rule. With this extra revenue, the Imam gifted some of his wealth to his firstborn son, Bilarab, so he could construct Jabreen Fortress. Jabreen Fortress was strategically positioned between the Omani capital of Nizwa and the fort of Rustak, where both Imam Sultan and his cousin, the first Yorubid ruler, Imam Nasir bin Murshid, were elected as Imam. When Jabreen Castle was finished in 1675, Imam Sultan was already nearing the end of his long 30-year reign. Only 4 years after the completion of Jabreen Castle, in 1679, Imam Sultan would die. The succession of his eldest son wasn't a guarantee. As stated before, both previous Yorubid Imams were elected by a council that convened at Rustak Fortress. There was no established hereditary succession either, as the first Yorubid Imam, Nasir bin Mushid, was merely a cousin of Imam Sultan. Despite this, upon the death of his father, Bilarab Yaruba would confirm the hereditary role of Imam. This was not against the laws of the nation, but it certainly was against the tradition of the state religion, Ibadi Islam. An important tenet of Ibadism required for the election of any state or spiritual leader, a notion that Imam Bilirab decided to ignore in order to become more similar to the rest of the world's hereditary, absolute monarchies. An action that he would one day come to regret. He formally transferred his royal residence to the newly constructed masterpiece fort of Jabrin, that, at a closer inspection, seemed to be more of a palace than a castle. Jabrin Castle is made up of a series of many right angles, ovals, and arches that somehow blend together and create an overlapping, yet opposite symmetry, with the best example of this style displayed by this staircase that leads to one of the 3 watchtowers. Entering the main palace complex, you will be delighted to find a grand reception room that is named the Sun and Moon Hall, that can observe both the sun rise and set. The Sun and Moon Hall was built in this fashion so Imam Bilirab could observe one of his favorite hobbies, astrology. This passion for observing the stars may explain the unique mural located on the wooden ceiling of the Grand Hall. Eyeballs, disguised as bundles of flowers and other flora, were painted all over the ceiling, ensuring that the room that so many looked out of was also always being watched over. Along with astrology, Imam Bilirab seemed to have been both a scholar of the arts and sciences himself and a promoter of fellow scholars, who frequently took up residence in Jabrin Castle to study alongside the Imam. Alongside the Sun and Moon Observation Hall, there was also a large library with a classroom connected alongside it. Exiting the Sun and Moon Hall, you will come to find a central square courtyard that draws inspiration from classical Greek architecture. Looking up, there is only the sky to greet you, as an opening cuts through the 2 levels above. The mentioned 2 levels feature intricate stone-carved windows that almost appear as if they are weaved, alongside arches and square windows that are carved in an outlining fashion. Imam Bilirab spent the majority of his 13-year reign behind the walls of his castle palace. After more than 60 years of war against Oman's former colonial oppressor, Portugal, Imam Bilirab's reign was very peaceful in comparison to his predecessors. With no raids on overseas Portuguese colonies being conducted, the Omani warships did still continue in their capturing of any Portuguese vessels that they happened to come across in their corner of the Indian Ocean. Many were happy for peace in Oman, but some still urged for continuous war against the Portuguese menace. The younger brother of the Imam, a man named Saif, was a leading member of the anti-Portuguese cause. During the final 3 years of Imam Bilirab's reign, Saif had started a rebellion against his scholarly brother, a justified war, as Imam Bilirab was not voted into his role as his predecessors had, meaning his overthrow was fair game for any member of the Yorubid family. The 2 men could not be more opposite. Like their father before them, Saif was a warrior, through and through. Not being able to fight the Portuguese was something that Saif and many Omanis simply could not accept. Having the warrior class on his side, Saif led a successful rebellion that eventually confided his brother to the fort palace that he cherished so much at Jabrin. The peace-loving Bilirab had no chance against the military expertise of his younger brother, who held the Imam in a siege for nearly 3 whole years. Many Omanis were indifferent to their Imam, who rarely left the sanctity of Jabrin Fortress. As Imam Bilirab had spent his reign behind the walls of Jabrin, so too would he die behind them. In 1692, Bilirab Yoruba would die unexpectedly. Sources remit how the Imam died naturally, but considering his hopeless position, I find it more likely that Bilirab may have committed suicide by poison. His brother Saif then was handed over Jabrin Fortress without a fight. Soon after, he proclaimed himself as the new and 4th Imam of Oman's Yoruba dynasty. Imam Bilirab Yoruba was without a doubt a great scholar and a lover of beautiful architecture. He was not even a bad Imam, just a slightly decadent one who was perhaps a bit out of touch with his people. This broke the trend of the first 2 much more warlike Yoruba Imams. Ultimately, this disregard for the continuation of war with Portugal would be his downfall. The Omani army was not ready for peace. They still sought more revenge against their Portuguese oppressor. Bilirab, the scholar imam, may not have led an exciting life or reign, but Bilirab was the builder of one of the Arabian Peninsula's most magnificent castles.
Imam Saif Yoruba was the first ruler of the Omani Empire. From his base in southern Arabia, he conquered much of coastal East Africa, liberating the land from his Portuguese nemesis, and carving out his own colonial empire. So how did this happen? How did Oman become an Arabian colonial empire at the height of European colonialism? Saif Yoruba was born sometime in the mid-17th century. By the time of his birth, his father, Sultan, had become the Imam of Oman and had successfully unified the country against the colonial Portuguese. While Saif was the son of the Imam, his destiny was fated to be the second-born to his older brother, Bilirab. To describe these two brothers as complete opposites would be an understatement. Bilirab pursued more scholarly passions such as astronomy, while Saif was more like his father, a warrior through and through. In 1679, Imam Sultan died and was succeeded by Bilirab. The new Imam spent much of his time in his palace fortress of Jabrin and cared little for continuing the Portuguese War. After spending 10 years as a scholar, the Omani people became frustrated with their complacent ruler. The Omani army and navy wanted war, and he was simply not giving that, or much else to them. In 1689, Saif would openly declare war on his brother. Bilirab was helpless in the face of his country and his brother revolting against him. Saif would begin a long 3-year siege of Jabrin Castle. The fort could have held indefinitely, and it only conceded to Saif once Bilirab had died mysteriously. So it is, in 1692, that Saif became the new Imam of Oman. Once asserting his reign by traveling to Muscat, Saif moved the royal palace from Jabrin to Rustak Fort, the very place where the elections of the Yoruba imams took place. At the start of his reign, he reinvigorated the war against the Portuguese, sponsoring wide-scale piracy that brought in vast wealth. With this wealth, Saif began to build underwater aqueducts that connected the interior freshwater wells to the arid coast of Oman. He also began to use his own pockets to plant fruit trees along the coast, a majority of which being date palms. The purpose for doing this was to inspire more people to live on the coast. This would benefit Saif by supplying him with more readily available soldiers and boat makers, thus strengthening an already dominant navy. By doing this, it also had the important side effect of helping to break up the interior tribes and, in turn, break up the tribal disputes that had plagued Oman for much of its history. These new coastal settlers could be considered the start of a new Omani people. After building up his navy for 4 years, he decided it was due time to bring the fight to the Portuguese. In 1696, Imam Saif's navy sailed down the coast of East Africa until reaching the Portuguese-controlled city of Mombasa in modern-day Kenya. Nearly 40 years ago, Saif's father had came to Mombasa, briefly conquering the city until the Portuguese recaptured it in the following year. Saif was here to finish his work. The siege of Mombasa mostly centered around the Portuguese fort of Jesus, which protected the harbor of the city. Fort Jesus was only manned by 70 Portuguese soldiers, along with a force of 500 soldiers from the allied queen of Zanzibar, Fatuma. The Omanis surrounded the fort by land and blockaded the port from reinforcement. Fort Jesus, despite its small garrison, managed to hold out for a year before Saif withdrew to his boats and sailed away. But he didn't sail back to Oman. Venturing south, the Omani Marines stormed the island of Zanzibar and take Queen Fatuma hostage. This was prompted when Fatuma attempted to sneak supplies into Mombasa. The queen was transported back to Oman, while Saif installed her son as the first tributary vassal of the Omani Empire. After this brief excursion, the Omani navy returned to Fort Jesus in early 1697. Whilst he was gone, the Portuguese hadn't received any reinforcements. and all of the Westerners had died from disease. This left an allied Muslim trader as the head of the fort. By this time, there were only 25 men and 50 women to hold off all of Oman. Fort Jesus was relieved on 2 separate occasions when Portuguese vessels managed to breach the blockade. However, the soldiers that came into Mombasa never came out, as they all died from disease once more. By the end of 1698, starvation had taken hold, and only 11 men remained. The time to strike had come. The Omani army storms the few brave soldiers, killing them all. After 33 months of siege, Mombasa and Zanzibar had fallen into the hands of the Omani Empire. The army only stayed for a short time repairing Fort Jesus and installing an Arabian governor to watch over this far-flung African colony. At the start of 1699, the navy leaves Mombasa, again sailing in the opposite direction of Oman. First, the Omani army captures the island of Pemba. Then they turn their attention to conquering the mainland coast of East Africa and take territories all the way down to their Zanzibari vassal. After this, the army continues venturing south, conducting a raid on the Portuguese-controlled island of Mozambique before finally returning to Oman. Shortly after the Omanis pillaged Mozambique, the Portuguese had finally sent a 1,000-man army to reinforce Mombasa. They arrived in Mozambique, witnessing the destruction left behind. Not having yet received word that Mombasa had fallen, the Portuguese sailed there, only to see that it was firmly in the hands of Imam Saif. The Portuguese decided not to attack. Instead, they landed on Zanzibar and succeeded in taking control of the island. However, in a short few months, disease overran the Portuguese camp and they retreated to India. Shortly after they left, Imam Saif re-established control over Zanzibar. In 1700 and 1701, the Portuguese sent armies to retake their East African holdings. They both failed, as disease had killed more of Oman's enemies for them than they themselves. With this, the Portuguese largely gave up on recapturing their colonies, leaving them to the new colonial empire in town. Oman just beat Portugal at their own game. The colonized was now the colonizer. However, the Omani brand of colonialism differed from the Portuguese. For starters, the Africans were much more willing to accept Islam than Christianity, as they already had contact with this religion. The Omani Empire was also very intermixed, Arabians settling down in Mombasa and Africans migrating to Muscat. The concept of race meant very little to the new empire, at least when compared to the Portuguese. The Portuguese also only built small trading forts in key cities on the coast, focusing their full attention on earning and exploiting wealth from the locals. While Imam Saif still did profit heavily from his new colonies, he was also a true ruler of the land that he had conquered, building many forts on the Kenyan coast as well as on Zanzibar. Having liberated East Africa, Imam Saif took a small break from war, rebuilding his navy and preparing for his next target. In 1703, the Omani navy sets course for India, which was home to a multitude of Portuguese trading forts. On the island of Salsette, the Omanis captured the poorly defended fort and looted the island for all its goods before returning to their imam. With these triumphs over the Portuguese, a vast wealth suddenly flowed into Oman's coffers. Imam Saif pumped this newfound gold directly back into his empire. He built more underwater aqueducts and planted numerous fruit trees. He also funded the construction of many new schools in Oman, even founding a naval school in Muscat. Apart from improving the everyday life of his people, he also added onto his seat of power, Rustak Fortress, ordering the construction of a 40-foot tall round tower that would come to be called the Wind Tower. The interior incorporated hundreds of triangles into its walls, beckoning back to his brother's castle at Jabrin. In 1711, Imam Saif Yoruba would pass away. He was said to be buried in a large and immaculate tomb. Unfortunately, this final resting place was disturbed and destroyed during an Omani civil war in the mid-19th century. Saif would be succeeded by his son, Imam Sultan II, who reigned over the Omani Empire peacefully for 7 years before his death in 1718. Imam Sultan left a young son behind to become the new ruler, causing a 30-year civil war that would eventually see the overthrow of the Yoruba dynasty and the start of a new ruling family in Oman. However, that is a story for another day. The story of Imam Saif and the First Omani Empire is one of the biggest exceptions in world history. In a time where European powers dominated the open seas and set up faraway colonies, Oman did the same thing, while also repeatedly beating their Portuguese nemesis. Although largely forgotten, they were the only Arab colonial empire.